Welcome to Juan's World, and this is the second in my series on Unpacking Christmas. And today I'm going to talk about mincemeat much more thoroughly. I'm going to talk about its history a little bit, and I'm also going to complete what I started last time. Last time, if you remember, I had some fruit, 600 grams of different kinds of raisins, soaked in brandy for 24 hours. Then I added about a cup of brown sugar and a variety of spices, powdered spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, mace. The sweet spices of Christmas as far as I'm concerned. So now you can see I've also started to add some dried fruits. And I'm going to mix them all together, and I'm going to talk about everything that I need to do to get the mincemeat ready to pack down and mature. Now here's the next step. I've chopped up an apple, peeled it, cored it, and chopped it in small pieces. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take off the zest of a lemon onto the apple, and then I'm going to juice the lemon and mix everything together. And then my next step is I'm going to add some butter. I hadn't mentioned the fat part before. I'm going to mention it now because this is where the history of mincemeat comes in. So let's take care of the lemon and apple and mix that all together, and then I'll add the butter and talk about the history of mincemeat. Now the final step here, which you can't really see, I think, maybe just a little bit, is that I've added a stick of butter, melted butter. I could have grated the butter in here, but it's just as easy to melt it and mix it in. In traditional times, and still in England, they use grated suet, and that's our clue as to the meat part of mincemeat. It's the last surviving fragment. I don't think you really need any fat at all. I think you can get away with just doing it without suet or without butter or anything. But the butter adds a certain richness, a certain smoothness to things, so I do add it. And then now I'm going to just let this all settle down, and I'll come back to it week by week by week, and you'll see that it gets thicker and darker week by week by week, and it's already smelling wonderfully rich. Now let's talk about the history of mincemeat. So inevitably at some point someone will ask the question, why is it called mincemeat? What's the meat part have to do with it? After all, in British English, mincemeat or minced meat is the equivalent of American English of ground meat. And so given that there's no ground meat in the Christmas mincemeat, what's it all about? Well, the answer is not that complicated. Back in the 14th, 15th century, pies were made from ground or minced or chopped meat, and they were frequently seasoned with heavy spices and with fruits. That was just a common part of what was called a made dish. There were roasts, which were just meat on a spit, turned and turned over a fire until it was cooked. And then there were dishes that were concocted with meat, and they
pretty much always had fruit in them and heavy spices, if you could afford it. Obviously, these were spices that came from my part of the world now, Indonesia, India, Cambodia, what have you. So they were very expensive. But they helped preserve the meat along with sugar. Sugar is an antimicrobial, antibacterial, so that when you put together a pie made of chopped up meat, fruit, and sugar, it will last for a long time. And down into the Victorian era, people made very, very elaborate mincemeat pies. They were meat pies, but they were also with a lot of fruit and sugar and so forth. And the designs, as you can see here, were very complicated. Sometimes they would make them into the shapes of castles with turrets and battlements and whatnot. And they would give them as Christmas presents. And they kept for quite a long time. Well, round about the 19th century, people started getting rid of the meat and just making the pies out of fruit and spices and suet. The last vestige of the meat was the suet fat from around the kidneys of oxen. And that's what we have today. It's still called mincemeat as an atavism. That's about all that it is. So how you make your mince pies these days is really up to you. I've given you some very, very fancy examples, but there are also simple, like ones made in little cupcake holders or such. Usually in England, if you can find them, they make these special pie dishes for individual pies, which are concave. They're not like a muffin tin. They have a rounded bottom, and that's what I'm used to. But you can make all manner, and I do too. So here's a very small sample of what I've done over the years. And you could make a whole pie, like a whole pumpkin pie if you want, although I'm not crazy about that. It would be a two crust pie or a lattice top pie with a bottom short crust mincemeat in the middle and then a top crust which you then slice. Not crazy about that. I prefer individual mince pies because one of the superstitions in England is that you're supposed to eat one for every month of the year on Christmas Day, so that every month of the year brings good fortune. Well, I don't know. I in my younger days I might have been able to manage enough to get me to June, but these days I can barely make it to March. So that's not a thing that I do anymore. But it's part of our tradition, and it's one of the reasons that it's nicer to have individual pies. Actually, what I do is I bake about a dozen, sometimes 2 dozen, but certainly a dozen. And then I eat them slowly between Christmas Day and New Year's Day with whipped cream or brandy butter sometimes, but mostly with whipped cream. So that's mince pies. I hope you have a good weekend. And remember, Stir-Up Sunday is coming up, and I'm going to talk about making Christmas pudding, although I realize that I've already done that once before, so this will be Christmas Pudding Mark II. Have a great weekend.